So here it is. This cost around £5.50, which if anyone knows cotton paper is incredibly cheap. I'm Sketches.n.scrubs. Thank you for tuning in. I make weekly art tutorials, paint-alongs and vlogs, and today I'm going to be reviewing the CassArt KhadiPaper. As always, I'm going to leave some timestamps here so that you can jump to particular parts if you wish to do so. But to give you a rough overview, I'm going to explain why I bought the KhadiPaper, do some swatches, a paint along, and then end it with a comprehensive review as well as similar pieces that I've done for comparison so that you can decide which paper you prefer. Hey, thank you for tuning into my video. So a couple of weeks ago I went to CassArt and I did a massive haul. I spent hundreds of pounds on art supplies, something that I have never done before and probably won't do in the near future again. So I bought lots of things that I wanted to experiment with. One of those things was KhadiPaper, which is 100% cotton, handmade, recycled, and they don't actually say whether it is cold pressed or hot pressed, but looking at the texture of it, it resembles cold pressed paper. So here it is. This cost around £5.50, which is incredibly cheap to get this many sheets of cotton paper. So I'm really curious to see how it performs. I'm going to be comparing it against this, which is the Rowney paper, which is also cold pressed, but it's not 100% cotton. And this is has been my go-to for painting. And as you can see, it started off with 50 sheets. Now there are 4 sheets left. To start off with, I'm going to do some swatches from the Cotman, Winsor & Newton set, which I've done a review of, and if you haven't watched it, that's the thumbnail up there, and I'll link it. But essentially I've already swatched on the Rowney paper the entirety of the colours, and for this I thought it'd be more useful to just do swatches of the primary colours, warm and cool versions, as well as the colours that I tend to use most. I start off with the yellow hue, then the gamboge, then the deep red cadmium, then the rose madder hue, then I add the permanent rose because it's my favourite colour so far at the moment. It's really bright. The turquoise followed by the cerulean blue that I don't tend to use as much, either of those blues. Then the sap green and the hooker's green light, and essentially because I do florals, these are the colours that I use most, as well as the Payne's grey that I don't swatch. So comparing the two, it's actually the cadmium deep hue is actually a lot brighter on the Rowney paper, as well as the permanent rose and the deep red cadmium. Apart from the deep red cadmium, which dried more vibrant on the Rowney paper, the other colours actually dried better on the KhadiPaper, which was a nice surprise. I'm going to be recreating the painting on the right, and one of the first things that becomes quite obvious when I start using the KhadiPaper is that it's a lot drier than the other paper. So as I'm using the paint, I'm finding that I need to use a lot more water to try and get the same effect. So as you're looking, you can kind of see that the insert is quite bright, which means it's still wet, whereas the KhadiPaper is quite dry and quite dark. The main issue with that is just when it comes to mixing colours, sometimes they won't blend as nicely if the paint has already dried. So quite often you want to kind of strike a balance between something that stays, a bit wet just so that you can mix it, and then dry so that you can layer it quite well. That being said, although it was unexpected, I did actually quite like the effect. It's quite hard to reproduce. I find that if I wanted to try and make the same effect with a different paper, I would have to waste quite a lot of paint and just load a lot of paint, whereas that wasn't the case here. The rougher texture of the paper is essentially down to personal pros and cons, but in terms of the kind of clear other pros that the KhadiPaper has, it is 100% cotton, which is good quality. It is handmade. If you appreciate craft, it's recycled, so if you're conscientious about the environment, then that's also another very good positive. The colors are very vibrant, still very similar to other watercolor papers that I have used, but certainly some of the blues were more vibrant on the KhadiPaper than they were on the Rowney, but conversely the reds were a bit duller. In terms of the texture of the paper, it is heavier than normal cold press paper. So if you wanted something between rough and cold press, and this would probably be it. Looking at the website, it doesn't say it's exclusively watercolor paper, but it says it can be used for watercolor paper. So if this isn't quote unquote watercolor paper, then I am incredibly impressed, because it has handled watercolor very well. It didn't tear and it didn't buckle at all while I was doing the layering in another piece, which I'll show you at the end. And then the other obvious pro is the price. Like, to get a 20-page sketchbook with 100% cotton paper for £5.50 is incredibly cheap. It's definitely a good choice if you're thinking about getting more accustomed with cotton paper and you don't want to kind of splash out on the expensive ones. I think this would be a good way to bridge the gap. That being said, I am yet to fully experiment with cotton paper, but I do think that that's a video in the future, comparing this to the more expensive cotton paper to just see what the clear difference is. Would I buy this again? Yes, I would. Would I buy it instead of all my other papers? I don't think so, purely because I like my papers being a little bit more predictable, a little bit more standardized, but definitely I think that there's a place for this. On a separate note, I really did enjoy making this piece. I really do like painting peonies, and I think they don't always work out, but in this instance they definitely did. I am going to be making a video in the future just going through how I paint peonies in more detail, as well as other florals, so that you can join in if you found that this paint along was a little bit too fast. And this is the final piece. For me, my favourite one ended up being the florals on the KhadiPaper. I just really loved that rough edge, which I haven't had before, and was kind of like a happy accident. But in a little while I'll show you this piece side by side, clearer, as well as a different piece where I layered the papers, and you can tell me which you prefer down in the comments. In terms of obvious pros and cons, to recap on the pros, it's 100% cotton paper, it's handmade, it's recycled, it retains vibrant colours, it has rough deckled edges, it's heavier than normal cold pressed paper, it didn't tear or buckle when layering, and obviously the price. One of the main cons that I noticed just flicking through it is that there are a few pages that have some imperfections on it, so a few creases, like bits of paper that are kind of scrunched up almost, and clearly that's not how the paper is meant to be. The other kind of thing that I've noticed is that some of the pages are different sizes, and also some of them are different thicknesses, so different GSMs by the feeling of it. But I imagine that that means that some papers will buckle more than others, some will absorb differently as well. So these are just kind of initial first impressions comparing it to a known brand of watercolor paper. I also did a piece where I layered a lot, so tell me which one you prefer, number 1 or number 2, and then the pieces that you've just seen, left or right. I hope that you enjoyed the video. I hope that you learned something. If you have any other questions about the KhadiPaper, please let me know. As I said, I will probably do like a sketchbook tour once I finish it, and if I have any additional thoughts about it, I will include that in that video. But yeah, thank you and see you next week. Bye.